Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock is where children like Leo with gender dysphoria are treated on the NHS. That's when the body they're born with doesn't match their gender identity. Sky News research suggests 35 psychologists have resigned from the Children's Gender Service in London in the last 3 years. We've managed to contact 20 of them. Only 6 would speak to us. All 6 said they were concerned about giving hormone treatment to children with gender dysphoria. All 6 felt they weren't able to properly explore underlying psychological factors.
Looking back, there are young people who I now wouldn't necessarily put on medication or sign off on medication.
This was the only clinician prepared to be interviewed. They asked us to change their voice.
I was once working with an executive that felt the gender dysphoria a young person was presenting with was really strong, really intense. So she decided to put the young person forward for the hormone blocking treatment after 2 appointments. Looking back, it was a young person with a history of trauma and direct trauma in terms of abuse. And also there were other things happening to them, and this was not really explored by the clinician.
These views were echoed by others who had worked at the clinic. Therapy is not an option in this service, one psychologist told us. We fear that we have had front row seats to a medical scandal, said another. The whistleblower says they saw many female-born patients with underlying issues, such as experiences of homophobia or even a history of abuse.
The numbers started growing from 2012, when we started seeing more females coming forward, and this has happened across the Western world.
And as a psychologist, did you ever feel that you could say to a parent, "I don't believe your child is trans"?
No, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to leave the service, because as a psychologist, I felt that if I ever spoke to a family like this, I would immediately be called transphobic.
A record number of young people are being referred to the Children's Gender Service at the Tavistock. There were just 77 patients referred here 10 years ago. By last year, the number had climbed to 2,590 children, the majority female at birth. And they've told us around 3,000 more children are on the waiting list. The clinic sees children under 18, some as young as 3 years old. Around half the children who come here are put on drugs at puberty to essentially pause their physical development. That would be the first step of any medical intervention. The next would be hormone treatment at 16 years old, and any surgical procedures would only happen after they turned 18.
A senior clinician working full-time is expected to carry a caseload of 120 to 130 young people. Compared to child and adolescent mental health services, generic services where the equivalent would be 40 cases. At the moment, there's only one pathway through the service. It's a medical pathway, not a psychological one. But I wasn't aware of this when I joined the service as an enthusiastic LGBTQI ally.
This is Luke. He's 17 years old and was also born female. He now identifies as male. Luke first came out as trans at 14 years old. And when we met, he'd been on the waiting list at the Tavistock for 2 years. Since his referral for treatment, it's been an agonising wait.
I was in such a bad place mentally that I told Mama that I can't go any longer. Like, I'm like in pain, and we were coming out from the GP and I kind of like started tearing up, and like I told her like I can't go any longer. And she started tearing up and we both started crying, and then she told me that if it is what I need, then we'll go privately.
That was a turning point for Luke, and he set up a phone consultation with a GP he found online. They prescribed him testosterone, which he now applies as a cream. He's essentially changing his body himself. So how much did the phone consultation cost you?
If I remember correctly, maybe like around £50. I think if you go for like the Skype call session, it's a bit more expensive. But every so often.
So they didn't see you in person?
No.
And they prescribed you testosterone?
Yes.
Ruby began identifying as male at 13 years old. Now 21, she'd been planning to have surgery to remove her breasts. But in May, she made the decision to come off testosterone and detransition to identify as female, her sex at birth. She doesn't want to be identified, so we've changed her name.
I figured it would be better for me to try to deal with my gender dysphoria in a different way, rather than permanently changing my body.
How much support did you feel was out there for you when you came to this conclusion?
I didn't feel like there was any support out there, other than like a few friends online.
Ruby now feels her eating disorder was more of a factor than she first realised in her gender dysphoria.
None of the therapists that I spoke to brought that up. They didn't think that it was linked.
Do you?
I think so, yes, because they're both kind of based in how I feel about my body, so I've seen similarities between the two.
Charlie Evans is forming a charity to support people in Ruby's position. After going public with her detransition story, she discovered an online community of 5,000 in a similar position, 30 people alone in her area of Newcastle.
I was approached by a young woman with a beard, and she hugged me and said, I'm a detransitioned woman as well, I've just stopped taking testosterone. And after that I felt like I had to do something. I'm hearing from hundreds of people, and I think some of the common characteristics are they tend to be around their mid-20s, they're mostly female and mostly same-sex attracted, most are lesbians, and often autistic as well.
Young people struggling with their gender identity may be referred to England's only specialist clinic, the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, based at London's Tavistock and Portman Foundation Trust. It's a difficult area to work in, and last year, following serious staff concerns over children's welfare, the Trust conducted an internal review of the service. It recommended areas for improvement, but did not identify any immediate issues in relation to patient safety. Yet evidence, exclusively seen by Newsnight, reveals serious tensions at the heart of GIDS. We've seen well over 100 pages of transcripts of interviews conducted with staff as part of the review. They make a series of claims. Staff say they were discouraged from going to the lead safeguarding officer with concerns about children's welfare. They say decisions about medical treatment were taken too quickly, and they say that some parents appear to prefer their child was transgender and straight rather than gay, pushing them towards transition. The transcripts have been voiced in this film by actors and edited for clarity, but the words were all relayed by GIDS clinicians to the Trust's medical director as part of the review process.
Let's pray that I am wrong, because if I am not wrong, very many vulnerable children have been very poorly treated and will be left with potentially a lifetime of damage here. We're not talking about little things. The reality is, by not doing anything, children are potentially still being medically mismanaged.
When a child is assessed by GIDS, they may be offered a drug called a puberty blocker. These stop a young person's body developing breasts, periods, facial hair or a deeper voice. The NHS has recently updated its guidance on these drugs, acknowledging that little is known about their long-term effects or what impact they might have on children's brains and bones. GIDS has said in the past it finds itself caught between people who want these treatments to be given quickly and those who think they shouldn't be given at all. Many children referred to GIDS are extremely distressed and have complex needs. The clinicians we've spoken to say there's often lots to explore before medication should be considered, but they say there's wide variation in practice. It's claimed in the transcripts that many staff are worried and openly discuss their fears.
Maybe we are medicating gay kids, maybe we're medicating kids with autism, maybe we are medicating traumatised children. And if we are, we're doing bad things to these vulnerable kids.
NHS England says that young people should be referred for medical treatment, puberty-blocking drugs, after a minimum of 3 sessions. But the review heard from several staff that one member of the GIDS leadership, Sarah Davidson, would refer children for treatment after only 1 or 2 appointments.
I was working with an executive on one case of assessment of a young person, and the executive member agrees to refer this person to the medical pathway within the first hour of meeting him.
And that is not supposed to happen?
Absolutely, it should never happen, because this is a pathway that will lead to huge changes for this young person. You know, it could lead to potentially infertility and so on.
We've been told that cases like this have been discussed at team meetings in GIDS. When some staff raise concerns about the speed of assessment, we understand the response was typically that the young person was experiencing very intense and severe gender dysphoria. Such a quick referral wouldn't allow for full exploration of what else is going on, staff claim. They say this could risk putting young people on potentially life-changing medicines who may have been struggling with issues such as their mental health and sexuality. Homophobia in families is mentioned in all of the transcripts Newsnight has seen. Staff say that while there was some discussion in the service about this, they didn't feel the issue was properly addressed. We've spoken to a number of staff off the record. Most didn't want to go on camera, even on the condition of anonymity. But the transcripts are backed up by this former clinician who left GIDS last year. Their words are being voiced by an actor.
We did have a lot of families and parents who would actively tell us that, oh, I'm so glad at least my child is not gay or lesbian, implying that having a trans outcome would be better for their children.
I had a case. There was a lot of trauma in the family. The young person had come out initially as a lesbian and had faced a lot of homophobic bullying, both very subtly within the family and quite openly in school. And suddenly the young person changed their mind and they started identifying as trans.
In some of these cases, clinicians thought that it wouldn't be appropriate for them to refer for puberty blockers, but they would be overruled by GIDS director Polly Carmichael, the transcripts suggest.
The young person had very clearly told me and my colleague that my mum wants the hormone more than I do. And when we took it to senior management, Polly Carmichael, she suggested that we refer, even though this was not clinically indicated.
These are only some of the examples mentioned in the transcripts. Staff also voiced concerns about the degree of trauma they're witnessing in children and the process of gaining consent for medical treatment. It's accepted in the review that staff raised these concerns over a number of years, both to the leadership of GIDS and to senior figures in the Tavistock Trust. But in the transcripts, staff say they weren't listened to.
The reality is that our concerns were raised all the time and were shut down.
And that when they did speak up, they were then seen as the problem.
People who raise concerns are seen as troublemaking and difficult. I think it is the case that somehow the organisation works to evacuate people who are not compliant.
When I raised concerns, I was told that I had to toe the line, or I would never progress in my career.
Staff also say that senior management were not able to reassure them that their concerns were unfounded.
I kept saying to her, "Are we hurting children?" And she did not say no. I kept saying to her, "Will we get sued?" She did not say no. The only solace she gave me was that she said it would not be me that would be sued, it would be the Tavistock that would be sued. She was not able to say to me, "It's fine, we are not hurting the children."
In the transcripts we've seen, clinicians are worried about the impact different kinds of abuse might have on young people trying to resolve questions about their gender identity. These could be seen as safeguarding issues. Staff claim they were discouraged from referring these cases to social services and from seeking advice. The Tavistock, like other NHS organisations, has a named person clinicians can turn to discuss specific safety concerns. That person is Sonia Appleby. But the transcripts allege that staff were discouraged from speaking to her by the director of GIDS, Polly Carmichael.
There was a very clear message from senior management about being really cautious about how we talk to the safeguarding team at the TAVI, and specifically Sonia Appleby.
I know that Polly feels she does not like Sonia's scrutiny. I think that is odd. She is the trust safeguarding lead.
I've had some consultations with Polly Carmichael about some of the young people I was seeing and some of the concerns I'd raised, and Polly very directly told me not to go to Sonia to share those concerns.
Is that safe?
No, and I would say that perhaps that's why more than 40 clinicians decided to leave the service within 3 years.
We've been told that if clinicians did approach Sonia Appleby, they felt she understood the complexity of the GIDS work and was supported by her. Mrs. Appleby's solicitor told us that she'd started legal proceedings against the trust last year and it wouldn't be appropriate to comment further.
Lives are changed at the Tavistock Centre, and what happens here has long drawn attention. Questions about how and whether children should be able to reassign their gender. Children like Keira Bell, who never imagined her story would lead her here.
I'm delighted at the judgment of the court today. It was a judgment that will protect vulnerable people. I wish it had been made for me before I embarked on the devastating experiment of puberty blockers. My life would be very different today.
Keira was 16 when she went to the Tavistock Centre. She started receiving hormone blockers and later surgery to become Quincy. She regretted the decision, and today, in a landmark ruling, a judge said her case had shown it's doubtful 14 and 15-year-olds could understand long-term risks of treatment, and highly unlikely children under 13 can give competent consent.
I was extremely upset and, just realising how traumatic the experience was and how deceitful I feel that the clinicians were during my care. It was heartbreaking. Medical transition doesn't have to be the way for you. You know, you can come out of this the other end.